Let's say you're given the choice between betting on player number 1 who has an average shooting percentage of 90% but ends up missing 10 shots in a row versus player number 2 whose average shooting percentage is only about 50% but did recently make 9 shots in a row. Between the two players, who are you likely to bet is going to make the next shot? Or better yet, let's say you're playing a game of chance and you're winning some money and you happen to win 5-6 times in a row. Do you keep letting it ride and keep on betting, or do you go ahead and cash out and walk away? Now the truth is, the whole idea of a hot hand or being on fire and having a winning streak is actually a lie. You see, in that scenario with the two different players, let's just say they're playing basketball, you'd actually be better off passing the ball to player 1, even though it doesn't quite feel that way. You see, this whole scenario is what's known as a hot hand fallacy, which I don't necessarily blame you for not believing me that you should be passing to player 1, even though he's missed 9 times, 10 times in a row. But if you watch through this video, not only will you understand the hot hand fallacy and how it works and why it works, and why most people fall for it, but also why it may be costing you some money as well. Now, to briefly explain what the hot hand fallacy is, it's basically this irrational belief that somebody can either be hot or cold, and somehow that changes this game of odds or statistics that you're playing, when in reality that's not what happens. Now, in that sports analogy I made, it certainly is true that you can make the argument that you shouldn't pass it to player 1, even though they have an overall higher shooting percentage. They may be missing because of some kind of underlying reason. For example, maybe they have a hurt arm, they have some kind of minor injury they're playing through, or maybe something's happening mentally where they're kind of off their game a little bit. With that being said though, their overall shooting percentage has already factored in a ton of different games where they perhaps worked through a minor injury, or perhaps they were distracted mentally. So to make that argument that that's the reason why you shouldn't pass it to them, that isn't really the case, because the odds are already factored in there. If you still don't believe me, think about it the reverse way. Let's take an average player, let's just say me for example, and that my average shooting percentage, to make it realistic, is something like 30%. And on a particular day, I end up making 9-10 shots in a row. Do you think I'm going to make the 11th or 12th shot and that my shooting percentage is all of a sudden 80% or 90%? Or do you think it's more likely that it's just kind of a fluke, that it's just a random occurrence that ended up happening? Because if you think about it, there's nothing that all of a sudden changed. My skill set didn't change. It's not like the new Nike shoes I bought suddenly changed my skill set and I can suddenly score more points. My overall shooting percentage still is about 30%. It's nothing has really changed. And sure, you can make the argument that perhaps I'm in some kind of rhythm or I'm in the zone and that's why I'm shooting better than normal. But you could also make that same argument the other way, say that the pressure of me making this next shot, because I made so many before that, is kind of decreasing my skill set and ends up kind of mentally distracting me. So making that argument, you could play it both ways, but the reality is that my overall shooting percentage remains the same. In fact, researchers have studied this, that they viewed a whole bunch of different NBA games and statistics throughout these NBA games, and basically found if somebody makes a whole bunch of shots in a row, they're not necessarily any more likely to make the next shot versus missing that shot. The whole hot hand fallacy can be better understood when you think about a game of chance or statistics. Let's take a gambling game such as roulette, where the odds of what color you bet on, red or black, ends up being about 50-50. If you end up playing this game of roulette and happen to make 4 different calls where you actually won, let's say you bet on red again, you bet on black, and all these different times you end up winning, on that 5th bet, you're probably going to feel like the odds are in your favor, that you're actually more likely to win, when the reality is that the odds are always the same. They're 50-50. Now compare this scenario to a different scenario where you walk up to a new roulette table and the group of people around that table say, hey, look at this person Joe. This person Joe has been winning over and over and over and has not lost yet. And Joe ends up betting on red. Are you going to go all in on red simply because Joe has a hot hand, so to speak? Probably not, because you have no attachment to that winning streak, versus when it's yourself, that winning streak, that hot hand feels more real. And this is kind of a good lesson, that when you're closer to a situation, you end up kind of messing up the odds or the statistics in your mind, versus when you remove yourself from a situation, you kind of start to think objectively, or at the very least, you kind of pause and kind of relax a little bit and think about the statistics, then you are more likely to calculate the odds a lot better in your mind. In fact, we kind of see this situation play out in the reverse to the extreme. Let's say you had the choice between 2 different slot machines. Slot machine A, where nobody's used it all day, nobody's lost or won on that slot machine, versus slot machine B, which is pretty much identical. It's the exact same machine. The only difference is that somebody named Sue ended up using it before you and has lost 20, 30 times in a row. You're probably going to choose that slot machine because you're thinking a new win, a jackpot prize, is coming up pretty soon. Now, this more has to deal with the gambler's fallacy, which I'll talk more about in a separate video, but all you have to understand here is the fact that those two slot machines are identical. The odds of winning on either machine are still the same, but you feel like one machine ends up having better odds for whatever reason. To begin to explain why we're so bad at odds and chances and statistics, it's because as humans we tend to generalize things and tend to stereotype things because it ends up making decisions a lot easier and quicker for us. For example, if I want to make a choice between going to a good fancy restaurant and all I have to make my decision is just based on the average price that each restaurant charges, then I'm probably going to go to the more expensive restaurant, even though I don't necessarily know what the restaurant looks like. I have no idea where it's located. Just solely based on price, I have a stereotype in my mind that more expensive food tends to be good or fancier for whatever reason. Does that mean you can't have good fancy food at a cheap price? No, not necessarily, but if I have only that to make my decision based off, then those generalities tend to help me. Another good example of this would be if I'm interviewing at a new workplace and I end up walking through that workplace, you only have usually an hour, a couple of hours to get a feel or vibe for that place. So you end up generalizing things in your mind. You end up getting a look at the decor and you end up thinking, is this decor kind of fit to your style? Even though it could have no basis on whether or not you're a right fit for that workplace, you end up generalizing and building those stereotypes because it can help you in some cases make good decisions. Now, obviously these generalizations and stereotypes can have its own problems, and one significant problem is when something deviates from that stereotype or generalization. Our minds can't necessarily cope with that, and the same is true with the hot hand fallacy. If I know somebody, let's just say Bob, only shoots 50% on average, and he ends up making 10, 12 shots in a row, my mind just cannot conceptualize that, so there has to be some kind of explained reason out there why this is happening. So the idea of someone being hot or being in the zone or on fire is the easiest way for us to kind of conceptualize why somebody may be shooting above their normal shooting percentage. We end up making more complex reasons and not necessarily just thinking that odds and chances are just completely random. So the idea of someone making 10 shots in a row could just be completely by luck or completely by chance. And I'm guilty of this too. Think about going to a grocery store and you end up parking at this grocery store and someone happens to park right next to you and ends up being similar age, kind of similar style, maybe they wear similar clothes to you. You end up going into the grocery store and you end up walking out and checking out at the exact same time. You end up walking out to the car together and you end up thinking in your mind, maybe there's some kind of reason for why this person parked me. Maybe I'm meant to talk to them. Maybe they're meant to be my friend. You end up coming up with these complex reasons, even though the reality is if you think about how many times you go to the grocery store, there's probably a good chance this scenario happens. Another fun example of this is if you take about 20 people in a room, there's a good chance, about a 50-50 chance that two people share the same birthdays. And that may seem pretty odd to us because we can't conceptualize statistics very well. So in the end, when you have a random birthday party and you meet somebody that has the same birthday as you, you think, man, there's a reason why I met this person. They have the same birthday as me. How crazy is that? So going back to these games of chances, if I'm flipping a coin and I think, how likely is it for me to flip a coin heads twice in a row? The odds is actually only 25%, but if I end up flipping heads on the first try, then the odds of me flipping heads again, in my mind, I still think it's not that likely. But the reality is given the fact that I already had heads once, the odds of me flipping heads the next time is still 50-50, even though for me it feels like tails seems to be more likely. So going back to this idea of sports for a moment, if you take somebody with a low shooting percentage but they end up making 9-10 shots in a row, you think that there has to be some kind of fundamental reason why that's happening, even though the reality is when you take the amount of different players and the amount of different games that are played every single year, there's a good chance actually that there's somebody out there that's going to end up making 9-10 shots in a row, even though their average shooting percentage doesn't support that type of behavior. So how does the hot hand fallacy actually apply in real life, and how can it actually cost you money? Well, probably the best example of this is stock picking. There's a lot of people out there that will claim, hey, look at these 9, 10, 12, 15 different stocks I picked. How could it possibly be that I end up picking all these stocks and getting it right every single time? There must be a reason. I must must be on fire. I must really know my stuff. Even though the reality is if you take 1,000, 10,000 different investors, there's actually a really good chance that a few of them will end up making every single right call. But the reality is it's just by chance. There's not really a fundamental reason. They're not necessarily more wise or smarter than everybody else. It's just a chance. Now, the problem becomes when these different investors or stock pickers end up claiming that they're the best stock pickers out there and that everybody should end up investing their money with them. And then they end up losing big. They end up thinking that they had some kind of inherent genius in them that caused them to be the right stock picker, when in reality it was just by chance. So they end up losing big at some point down the road. And that's not necessarily to say that there aren't people out there that do actually have better percentages. But I'm just saying that if you just took 1,000 random people, one person out there, or a couple people actually, would end up having a few good stock picks for a couple of years, but at some point down the road, they're going to end up losing big. So to really illustrate how the hot hand fallacy can kind of cost people, think about this situation that actually has played out before, where I end up, not necessarily me, but common scammers out there do this, where I end up sending 10,000 different emails out there to different people. And on a sports game, I say team A is going to win. I send that out to half the group, to 5,000 people. To the other 5,000 people, I end up saying team B is going to win. So obviously, I'm basically playing both sides. And obviously, I'm going to win at least with one group of people. So let's say team A ends up actually winning the game. So now to these 5,000 people, there's kind of intrigue, right? How did this person know that team A was going to win? So now I divide that 5,000 group up even further. I divide up between 2,500 people in one group and 2,500 in the other group. And I end up doing the same thing. I end up saying to one group, hey, I think team A is going to win this next game, and team B, to the other group. And I keep repeating this process until about 10 different times that I end up, splitting up the same group and end up getting it right every single time to their minds. But they don't know all the other times that I lost. So what ends up happening is I end up believing that I must know my stuff, even the reality is I'm just basically playing both ends of the odds. So when it comes to the hot hand fallacy, it certainly is a balance between deciding whether or not it's just odds and chances versus if somebody actually has some kind of knowledge out there, such as the stock pick example. Maybe there are people that are more knowledgeable and they have insider information, or maybe this is something they've studied to a great deal, so that way they have better chances than the average person would. So it really is this fine balance, but what I would say is you have to at least recognize that we are really susceptible to the idea of discounting random chances, discounting the fact that given 100 people, that somebody out there is going to win a game of roulette 5 times in a row, but there's not necessarily an actual reason to it. And when it comes to that study, as far as proving that just because somebody makes a few shots in a row doesn't necessarily mean they're more likely or less likely to make the next shot, that there actually is research that shows that there was a little bit of a selection bias as far as how that research was done, but that the study actually still holds true, that the hot hand fallacy still is true. But the problem is that when you're talking about just a couple of instances, there can be a little bit of a bias. But at the end of the day, odds are still odds. The chance of me flipping a coin the next time, even though I had heads 5 times in a row, the chances are still 50-50 no matter what, and nothing can change that, not even a hot hand fallacy. If you made it this far in this video, I just want to say I really appreciate you guys. And if you like behavioral finance, consider subscribing to this channel or talking about these kind of inherent cognitive biases that we end up having. So if you like, the hot hand fallacy, or I'll talk about the gambler's fallacy pretty soon, please consider subscribing to the channel, and please consider giving it a thumbs up. And as always, hope to see you in the next one.